When two men appeared at a hospital after dark with a bag over their shoulder, they rang the doorbell of the dissecting room and a porter answered. When the porter told them he wasn't interested in buying a body, the men asked if they could store the corpse there overnight to lessen the chances of them being found wandering around the streets of London with a dead body. When the porter agreed and the men left the bag on the table and scuttled back off into the night, a foot flopped out of it. Thinking it looked very fresh, but not wanting to tie himself up as he was off to the theatre, the porter switched off the lights and left for the night. The following day, the men would return, saying they had a buyer and they would be taking the body, but its next destination would be where suspicions rose and the police were called. Today on Macabre London, we uncover the mystery of the Italian boy and the grim London Burkers. Everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Macabre London. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and today I'll be taking you on a journey down another of London's grimy backstreets to uncover a macabre tale from the city's past. Today we're going to be exploring the case of the London Burkers and getting to the bottom of a story which sees the authorities try to work out if a body was snatched from a grave or murdered, all for the provision of medical science. However, before we get into today's story, if you're new here and you want to see more videos where we deep dive into some lesser known historic tales from London, and in fact all over the world and beyond, then please don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. Also, if you like the show and you have done for a while now, then why not consider becoming a patron? You get your very own podcast feed filled with bonus episodes of my other show, Having a Problem, which is a lot of silly historical fun, and I just know you're going to love it. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, then the link is in the description. Or just go to patreon.com/Macabre London so I can continue to regale you with the haunted history we both love, and a little bit extra too. Before medicine was the way it is as we know it today, there had to be advancements made. This process took hundreds of years, and with many failures along the way, the only way incremental changes could be made was to use the bodies of the living, but mainly the dead. In a time when the general populace still believed in religion, the thought of turning a body over to be dissected rather than buried was a fate worse than death. And the families of the deceased would rather bodies stayed in the ground than were used to further the pursuit of science for the betterment of humanity as a whole. This hesitancy over fear of eternal damnation meant bodies were always buried, but with the need for specimens increasing as medical schools began to grow, a new profession emerged. One in which no questions would be asked by doctors, but would mean people brave enough to steal corpses could make a decent living from doing so. And this is where our tale today begins. Three men who were known body snatchers, John Bishop, James May, not that one, and Thomas Williams, had been operating in London alongside other occasional work and found the profession of body snatching to be fairly lucrative. However, when they arrived at one particular medical school with a body that seemed a little too fresh, suspicions were raised about their practices, and it seemed they may have been running an altogether far more deadly operation. At around midday, Bishop, May and Williams were all seen having a drink in the Fortune of War pub on Giltspur Street. As they supped their pints, another man came in to join them. All four disappeared off after finishing their drinks and weren't seen again until around 3 p.m. when they came back to the pub, this time without the other man, and this time they stayed until around 5 p.m. before leaving again. After heading out into the brisk autumn air at dusk, both Bishop and May approached a cabman who was waiting at a stand, refuelling his horse with a bag of corn and himself with a cup of tea. They asked if the cabman was interested in taking on a job, moving a stiffin, as they referred to it, but which the cabman instantly knew was a dead body. He was hesitant, but said maybe if the price was right, but he knew the pair were dodgy, so he asked them to go with him into the cabman's shelter, where there were others inside to keep him safe. Inside, the owner of the cab stand equally spotted the nefarious duo and purposefully nudged the cabman's elbow and gave him a knowing look. Silently, the pair worked together to get rid of them, and the cabman said he'd go get his horse, and the owner sent the pair up the road to wait. But little did they realise the cabman had rode off, and the men were now stood around waiting for a carriage that would never come. Realising they'd been fobbed off, the two men went to another pub, the King of Denmark, and approached a cabman in there and managed to secure a deal with him, but not before both May and Bishop necked half a pint of gin each. At about 6:30 p.m, Williams, Bishop and May were all seen with the cabman when they stopped outside the Birdcage pub in Bethnal Green, which was opposite where Bishop lived with his wife and children, in a little cottage on Nova Scotia Gardens. Williams stood chatting to the cabman as Bishop and May disappeared into the cottage, and before long the two men reappeared carrying a heavy-looking sack between them. Williams helped them load it into the cab before they set off again. The three men had a plan and asked the cabman to take them to Guy's Hospital, just across from London Bridge. They asked the porter there if he was looking for a body, but he declined their offer. However, the men said they couldn't just take it away again, so they asked if they could leave it there and collect it the following day. The porter agreed and locked the body, which was still inside the sack, in the dissecting room, as he was rushing off to the theatre and didn't want to be late. However, he was sure to leave a note for his colleagues the next day to let them know the men would be back to collect it the following morning. Now the body was safely locked away and their risk of being caught with a cadaver was off the cards, the resurrectionists had to secure a buyer for the boy. They went to a few other anatomy theatres and tried to secure a sale, but none of them wanted the cadaver, and so the men gave up and decided to go back to the pub. At just after 8 p.m, they were seen returning to the Fortune of War once again, but this time with their cabman in tow. May went up to the bar at this point, and in his hand he had a silk hanky. He was rubbing the contents of it between his fingers and showed the barman that he had a quantity of teeth inside it. Now, the Fortune of War pub was not a particularly swanky establishment, and among its patrons, the practice of body snatching was something which was turned a blind eye to by its staff. In those days, if people had money and wanted to spend it on beer, then there was no need to ask them how they came by it. The landlord looked at the teeth, and May wasn't shy about saying they were from a young boy of about 14 years old. But the landlord had no reason to get involved further, and so he just carried on working. After a few more drinks, the men left the pub at about 9 p.m, but May was intent on making at least a little bit of money that day, and so he stopped by a dentist on the way home and showed him the teeth he had in his pocket. The dentist said he'd buy them, but he wasn't willing to pay top price as he didn't think they'd all come from the same mouth. However, May assured him that they did, and said that the body had never even been buried. Returning home, May and Bishop called it a night, but they still had the pressing urgency of the corpse to get rid of, so by the following morning they were back in the city, in the hopes they could find someone to bite. If they could keep the body safely at Guy's Hospital for just a little longer, it would avoid them having to drag the body around with them and lessen the chances of being caught. On the 5th of November, just before midday, a porter, William Hill, was pottering around in the dissecting room of King's College, located within Somerset House, when suddenly the doorbell rang. Outside stood John Bishop and James May. Both men he was no stranger to, as they would regularly come and see if the surgeons had an order for them. Bishop asked if they might need anything, to which William said he didn't think so, but he'd go and ask. But before he could do so, the men said they'd already got something they could bring along, a boy around 14 years old. When inquiring about the price, May said he would cost 12 guineas, which in today's money is roughly about £1,000. Thinking this was far too high, but not wanting an altercation with the visibly tipsy May, William said he'd go and consult with his boss, Mr. Partridge, and come back to them. Soon he came back into the room along with Mr. Partridge and said that they didn't really need the body today, so would only be willing to give them 8 guineas for it. The haggling commenced and May stormed off when they couldn't come to an agreement at 10 guineas and didn't want to accept 9, which was the offer on the slab. However, the pair must have thought the better of it, as just a few hours later they returned with a heavy-looking hamper and once again rang the doorbell. William opened the door to 3 men and they were ushered into a secret room away from the main hustle and bustle of the college. Within the room, the hamper was opened and inside was a cloth sack. May picked up the sack and turned it out, and the body inside was clumsily and unforgivingly thrown onto the floor due to the handler's inebriation. The porter knelt down and inspected the poor boy. He commented on how fresh this particular corpse was, saying it was a good one for their requirements, and he said he would need to go and get their money from Mr. Partridge. But before he did so, William asked how the boy had died, to which the men said they didn't know. Alarm bells were already ringing for William at this point, as he noted that there was something which made him highly suspicious if this body had ever been buried at all. Firstly, one of the boy's arms was incredibly stiff, something which by the time a corpse had usually been delivered to them, the effects of rigor mortis had worn off, but it seemed there was still some rigidity to the poor boy's form, which hadn't yet subsided. Secondly, there was a telltale sign in that the boy's body was very free of sawdust, something which would be used during the burial process and would usually stick to hair and the body. Within coffins, makeshift mattresses of sawdust would be made so that the body could potentially sit in there for a few days and not leak all over the polished wood floor of the family home. Now, if you've ever had a pet hamster, guinea pig or other kind of rodent live in your home, you'll know sawdust easily gets everywhere and will cling to anything with even the slightest bit of texture, so it's no wonder the absence of the material was incredibly obvious to William. Reporting his finds to Mr. Partridge, he came to inspect the corpse away from the men and also showed it to some students who were with him at the time. Everyone, in their professional opinion, concluded that there was something not quite right about the body lying in front of them, and so a calm approach was taken to not notify the potential criminals within their midst that they were about to be caught red-handed. Mr. Partridge went and spoke to the men about their payment and said he'd need a moment to sort things out with breaking down a banknote and getting them the right money. So he asked them to go with him to a warm room with a fire where they could wait comfortably. Meanwhile, however, William had called for the police to come and take a look at the boy's body, and they too thought something was awry. Back in the warm room with the crackling fire, the men were starting to get antsy, and perhaps thinking they may have been rumbled, they told William that they'd just settle for whatever gold he had and they'd call it a day. But Mr. Partridge waved a large note in front of them, and feeling greedy, they decided to stay and wait for their owed gains. But their fortune wasn't to appear, and before long, police marched into the room, and upon seeing them, May tried to escape and attacked one of the police in a bid to get away. But his attempts at resisting arrest were futile, and the police arrested them all and carted them off to the nearby police station for questioning, and the body of the boy was taken along with them by the porter, William Hill. Once at the police station, May asked if he could speak with Bishop privately, and their arresting officer declined, so he stood up and hit him. The following day, Mr. Partridge and his medical knowledge were called to the police station to take the body for post-mortem. On closer inspection, he noted that despite there being minimal marks on the outer body, inside the boy's remains told a different story. In the neck, he found a large coagulation of blood, one which he thought, in his professional opinion, could have only been inflicted by blunt force trauma, but on the outside, the body didn't show anything apart from a small cut on his temple, one which Mr. Partridge said couldn't have been responsible for his cause of death. One thing he did note was that the boy's heart was empty of any congestion, something which he said he had seen in postmortems before when the patient had dropped dead suddenly from no outside influence. But in this case, he thought it was far more likely that the biggest clue was the big clot at the back of the neck, and not the empty heart. This internal violence made Mr. Partridge certain that this boy had indeed been murdered with the intent of providing his body to the medical profession, and now all he had to do was prove that the men that had said they'd found him dead, May, Bishop and Williams, were the ones responsible. Wanting a second opinion, Mr. Partridge asked a surgeon friend of his, Mr. George Beeman, to help with a further investigation of the corpse. George, who had been a surgeon for 9 years by this point, helped to carry out a more thorough post-mortem, and he too concluded that the blood found within the neck was what was most likely to be the reason for the boy's death. His organs were all checked over, and even his brain removed, but everything looked as healthy as could be, and so now it seemed conclusive that the boy had been killed by being hit by something, most likely a staff or stick on the back of the neck, which caused the huge internal hemorrhage. When looking at the spine, Mr. Beeman also noticed that blood had seeped into the bone marrow, which may have meant his neck was broken or at least fractured, and that also the muscles showed that rigor mortis had passed only a short while ago. All more signs that this was a very fresh corpse, and not one which had been sat around for the amount of time it would take to prepare a burial for him, let alone for him to have already been in the ground and then subsequently dug back up. One thing that did confirm that the corpse had been handled by people who knew what they were doing was obvious when the men looked in his mouth. Inside, all of the boy's teeth had been removed. Body snatchers were well aware that they could make decent money from a fresh set of teeth, and so all corpses were cleared of teeth before being delivered to dissection rooms. The reason for this was as a reasonable amount of extra cash could be made from dentists who were always looking for teeth to make sets of dentures from, as they could sell these for a pretty penny. In a time of early dentistry, when dentures were made from wood or porcelain, these rudimentary materials weren't always fit for purpose, whereas a fresh set of someone else's teeth ensured they look as natural as possible, and so a pocket full of gnashers could definitely earn a bit of extra money on top. In fact, tooth collecting was such a lucrative side hustle that some travelled to battlegrounds where they could reap the teeth of fallen soldiers and come home and sell them on for reasonable profit. One particularly notorious body snatcher, Tom Butler, took a trip to the Battle of Waterloo with the sole intention of tooth collection. Watching the battle unfold from the sidelines, he would wait until they'd moved on and only the bodies were left. He then went from corpse to corpse, filling a bag with any teeth he could. On his return to London, he sold the teeth for around £300, which in today's money would be around about £15,000. So when the men inspected the boy's mouth, they knew that the lack of teeth meant the body had definitely had a brush with body snatchers. But if this was murder, then who was the boy? And how had he found himself in the hands of such vile men? Carlo Ferrier, or his anglicised name of Charles, was an Italian immigrant. He'd been brought over from Italy at the age of just 12 as an economic migrant to London, and we have to assume that he was either an orphan or his parents sent him abroad in hopes of a better life. In the 1800s, many Italian people moved to London in order to escape the abject poverty Italy was experiencing after the Napoleonic Wars, and many people became street performers to make ends meet, and Carlo was no different. His selling point was that he had 2 white mice in a little cage, which he would have hanging round his neck, and also a pet tortoise. These little creatures would elicit interest from passers-by, and he would charge a tiny fee to hold them, enough to get a little bit of food. As many children on their own did in London at the time, Carlo would have also no doubt worked as an errand boy for people in his community in Bethnal Green, and picked up odd jobs here and there, and been in household service in return for lodgings. A small community of Italian immigrants lived in nearby Saffron Hill, and it's believed Carlo was lodging there at the time of his death. Carlo would have no doubt been spotted by the residents of No. 3 Nova Scotia Gardens, as he would work opposite and often stood outside the house during the day. When Bishop noticed the boy, he may well have seemed like an easy target to him, and perhaps his constant presence outside their home upset him somewhat. On the morning of the 4th of November, the neighbour at number 2 Nova Scotia Gardens said he was awoken to the sound of scuffling coming from next door. He said it sounded like 2 or 3 people, but that he'd not been alarmed and assumed it was just a family issue, as Bishop lived at number 3 with his wife and children. But the following day, it was noted that Bishop gave a gift to his children, 2 white mice in a little cage. Now, to understand about how these 3 men ended up in this position, we first have to understand a bit about body snatching and the supply of bodies to the medical profession. When there was no approved method of providing cadavers to students to practice upon, methods became nefarious. The trade of dead bodies became so rife during the Georgian and early Victorian period that families were never guaranteed that once their loved one was in the ground that they'd stay there. In a time before cremation, the method of disposing of bodies was to bury them. Depending on how rich you were, determined the level of safety your loved ones could afford for you. For those on the poor end of the scale, no protections were put in place as they simply couldn't afford them. But the more money you had, the better the chances were of protection for your deceased. Firstly, the burial ground itself was an important choice. Many churchyards went unmanned and open to grave robbers, but if you could pay a little bit more, you might be lucky enough to bury your dead in a ground with a watch hut on it, in which men would sit and deter any grave robbers. However, if the guards could be persuaded to turn a blind eye with a little backhander, or even worse, inform the body snatchers of fresh burials, you could well find yourself with a false sense of security, quite literally. Physical grave protection was also an option for those that could afford it. Metal-reinforced coffins, which weighed a ton and would be impossible to lift out of the ground, were an option. Mort safes, which were cages which went over a grave and also weigh down into the soil to prevent pilfering, were also an option. Another was to brick in the body or lay stones that were so heavy to remove that it was an impossible feat to get into the grave at all. Some graveyards had attack dogs which would roam the spaces, and in some cases when private cemeteries came along, they sold security by armed guards as standard protection, and equally made the perimeters tall and very difficult to scale whilst carrying a body. However, of course, there were ways to get around all of this, and if there's a trade for something, you can rest assured that people will find a way to sell it. And it wasn't just the bodies that had a market. Of course, I've already mentioned selling teeth, but hair was also sold to wig makers, clothes were taken and sold to second-hand dealers, and even coffin nails were collected and sold for scrap or back to coffin makers. It really did mean that everything went to good use. In terms of the need for anatomical subjects, doctors were in a vicious cycle. The mortality rate was high, and in order to learn about what was killing people, study was needed, but for that they needed dead bodies. But why was it frowned upon to use dead bodies in science? Well, mainly religion. People believed that if a body was dissected, they wouldn't go to heaven, and in a society governed by fear of eternal damnation, nobody wanted that. So the market created itself, and body snatching went on as a poorly hidden public dark secret for a very long time. One above-board way to come by a corpse was to be gifted an executed criminal, as this was a punishment actually dished out by the courts, to be hanged and then anatomised. However, the amount of cadavers available in this way was far below the demand, and so body snatching emerged as a profession. The act of body snatching itself wasn't actually illegal. A corpse didn't have any legal rights, but the stealing of property was a punishable offence, so there was a fine line between the men who called themselves resurrectionists, ones that just took the body, and grave robbers who stole anything and everything they could from the deceased, as well as the corpse themselves. Eventually the practice became so rife that no grave was safe, and anti-resurrection riots broke out in towns that had busy medical schools, as they were fed up with their loved ones ending up on a dissection table. Edinburgh in Scotland had a terrible problem with resurrectionists, and the body snatchers couldn't keep up, so they outsourced to bigger cities like London to supply them with bodies and had them delivered. However, the whole resurrectionist period of history is an episode in and of itself. And in the interest of this episode not being days long, let's get back to the task at hand. When the police began to investigate the case of the unidentified boy, they soon realised that from eyewitness reports from people in Bethnal Green, and the fact they all reported a young lad wearing a stripy vest and a green peaked cap with mice around his neck hanging around outside No. 3 Nova Scotia Gardens, that this sadly confirmed their suspicions that the corpse was that of Carlo Ferrier. After the men were arrested at Somerset House and taken to the police station, they stayed in custody until their trial, which began on the 1st of December 1831. At the trial, evidence was heard which laid out a specific timeline of events, and it was becoming very obvious that the men in the dock had murdered Carlo. In their own statements, they denied their guilt, but from evidence found inside Nova Scotia Gardens, namely the mouse cage, the boy's clothing, which was recovered from a shallow burial in the garden, and a bloody broadel, an instrument that's like a screwdriver but used for making marks on wood, it was condemning, to say the least. In a bid to protest their innocence, Bishop said in his statement to the court that his wife had bought the clothing which was found from a second-hand dealer in Bethnal Green, and that other items of clothing found in his garden could have been placed there by anyone, as the gardens to each of the cottages in the dwellings he lived in were all accessible by small gates, as the backs of the houses shared a well and a toilet, so he believed anyone could have buried them there. May said in his testament that he was with a woman at the time of the suspected murder, and she corroborated this in court, but when cross-examined, her story quickly fell apart when no one else had seen the pair together, and when so many others had said they'd seen May and his colleagues all together during this time elsewhere. He also called on another 2 witnesses from his lodgings at 4 Dover Street, where he lived with 2 sex workers, Charlotte Berry and Mary Ann Horn. Interestingly, an item of clothing that was seized from May's lodgings was a pair of trousers that had coagulated blood on them. Both women who saw clients at home said they'd both been busy working, but had seen May at home that evening, where they chatted and he went to his room. They said the blood that was found on the trousers was from an accident which happened in the home. Charlotte had been downstairs in the kitchen speaking to her landlady, who had a pet jackdaw. Unbeknownst to Charlotte, the bird had hopped behind the heavy door where May's trousers were hanging after being washed, and she opened it to leave, pinching the corvid in the crack, which caused it to bleed on the trousers. The police checked that the landlady did have a pet bird, but when they looked at it, it seemed in very good health and with no marks upon it. After hearing everything within the court, it was now time for the jury to retire and to deliver a verdict, and by the following day, on the 2nd of December, they'd reached a conclusion. All 3 men were guilty of murder. When all 3 men were found guilty of their crimes, the huge crowd that had assembled outside the court were quickly updated. As the news spread within the crowd, cheering and clapping broke out, and the sound of jubilation at the certain convictions became so loud that the windows of the court had to be closed so as the sentencing could be delivered. All 3 men were sentenced to be hanged, and in an ironic twist of fate, ordered that they too would become medical cadavers for students to study, a punishment which was deemed as the worst eventuality, as they would be denied burial and therefore wouldn't be able to pass through the religious afterlife, and a purposeful choice by the judge to make sure the men got a taste of their own medicine. All 3 men were set to be executed on the same day, the 5th of December. However, after the trial, Bishop gave a further confession about the crime, the details of which have not been revealed, but it's believed he admitted to several other murders, and the numbers have been calculated at around 60 victims attributed to him, all provided as medical cadavers. This shocking turn of events meant that May was cleared of the death sentence and instead given transportation as punishment, being sent to Van Diemen's Land in Australia, which nowadays is called Tasmania. Williams, too, was implicated in the crimes by Bishop, and as it turned out, there were 2 missing people in Bethnal Green living on the street that both Bishop and Williams admitted to murdering. one older woman who had the surname Pigburn, and another boy a little younger than Carlo named Cunningham. These revelations changed the trajectory of the sentencing and also outraged the general public, and they showed up in their thousands to the public execution. Around 30,000 people descended on the city to watch the two men be hanged, and the crowd was so immense that barriers caved in under the jostling crowds and people struggled to avoid being crushed. The nearby St Bart's Hospital was inundated with injured spectators, and many people suffered from injuries as a result of the macabre spectacle. After the case of the London Burkers gripped the nation, it was not long before reasoning fell before the eyes of the government. By August 1832, just 9 months after Bishop and Williams were hanged for their crimes, the Anatomy Act was brought in. This new legislation meant that bodies could now be legally procured to further medical students, and unclaimed bodies of prisoners, those in workhouses, or any corpse which just happened to be found, could all now be given to medical schools, which stopped the need for body snatching and lessened the chances of burking, aka being murdered for the purpose of medical cadaver acquisition. The case of Carlo Ferrier no doubt played a huge part in hastening the passing of the Act, and now everyone could rest easy that once a loved one was buried, they would stay there. Throughout London for hundreds of years, people's bodies were routinely obtained and used to further the medical profession, and despite the nefarious and desecrating ways these corpses were obtained, they all played a very important part in making medicine the way it is today. The juxtaposition of religion and science meant that friction was caused between the two factions, but when eventually they reached an agreement, huge strides could be made which pushed medicine forward and allowed the dead to become the guides of the living. The people whose bodies were used were incredibly vital in helping these advancements, and to them we have to be truly thankful. Because of them, many of our ancestors and relatives survived, which means that we made it into existence. So in a weird roundabout way, we all have to be thankful to this gruesome profession and the body snatchers of the past. Thanks for joining me for this episode. As always, I'd love to know your thoughts on this one and tell me if any of this info is new to you or what facts you picked up from today's episode. So do please pop them in the YouTube comments or pop over to my social media. Find me at Nikki Macabre London on Instagram and at Macabre London on Twitter and TikTok. This episode saw me poring over old documents, diaries of body snatchers and Italian family trees and transportation records. And as you can imagine, it's a long but fascinating process which takes up a hell of a lot of time. So if you want to support me to help make these episodes even better and to contribute to my much needed coffee bill and to get extra content in return, including my extra exclusive Patreon podcast, Having a Problem, then check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Macabre London. If you're listening to the podcast, head over to YouTube to see the faces and places I talk about. Just search for Macabre London Podcast and don't forget to say hi in the comments and subscribe whilst you're there. For the coolest and comfiest merch known to man, visit macabrelondon-shop.fourthwall.com, which if you sign up to Patreon, you will also get a nice discount on merch. And if you're watching on YouTube, the merch is just hanging around underneath the video now, so it's incredibly easy to access. Just click on the products. A big thanks to my amazing top tier Patreon producers, Christina, Christoph, Heather's Leg, Lisa, Mary, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry, Teresa and Veronica, and all of our other fantastic patrons. If you want your name read out in the episodes or listed in the show notes, join us on Patreon. I'd love to personally welcome you to the Ghoul Gang, and if you sign up within the next week after this episode is launched on the £10 tier, you'll be in time for a Halloween goodie bag, which will be sent through the post by me to you, but be quick so you don't miss out. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from London's past. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time. Oh, and just as a little side note here, I'm going to give you some ASMR whispers at the end, but make sure you're following my Instagram for exciting news coming next week. Oh, exciting times. Make sure you do it. I'll see you then. Bye.